Okay, I guess I'll just dive in. I want to thank all of you for, being willing to host me virtually for this, which is really nice, and especially for letting someone who, as my career has progressed, keeps sending me farther and farther in the direction of comparative literature to interfere with the theological method that we're trying to explore today. So. Yeah, my paper is called The Fictionable World, Artifice, and the Fashioning of Truth. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so there's something I think that just bothers me about Samuel Taylor Coleridge's doctrine that necessary for what he calls poetic faith, that is, what is necessary for believing in the truth of a creative narrative work, is a willing suspension of disbelief. Though willing suspension of disbelief is certainly necessary for certain kinds of fiction, such as fairy tales, it just does not work in authors of self-conscious fiction. I am thinking especially of Gustave Flaubert, Jorge Luis Borges, Vladimir Nabokov, and Toni Morrison. Robert Alter defines self-conscious fiction as literature that systematically flaunts its own condition of artifice, and by doing so probes into the problematic relationship between real-seeming artifice and reality. Such fiction flies in the face of poetic faith, as even the fiction seems not always willing to suspend disbelief about itself. Often, as in works like Nabokov's Pale Fire, Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, the second half of the Quixote, very nearly anything by Borges, self-conscious fiction does not believe in itself at all. It knows that it is a literary construct, knows that the only thing there for belief is the sleight of hand. The writing is quick and relentless in this tradition inaugurated by the Quixote, to remind its reader about the dangers of confusing artifice for reality. For the two go very nearly hand in hand. Indeed, implicit in Coleridge's notion of poetic faith and its attendant willing suspension of disbelief is this idea that to forget that one is created somehow profanes creation. Yet if we were to prove the existence of God, and I mean really to prove it, I doubt very much that we would be able to prove the existence of anything else, ourselves included. For what, after all, separates the real world from any fictional one? Socrates often speaks of the ways that artifice and writing take us further away from the real, and about those things Plato writes, and writes a lot. The real, like the created, the crafted, or the manufactured, in a word, the fictionable, is not an explanation, as the literary critic Michael Wood puts it in his book on Nabokov. It is a disputed territory. Though self-conscious fiction is very concerned about the myriad ways that we, both in reading and in life, confuse artifice and reality, as this is what makes it self-conscious fiction, what it is not concerned with is that the reader might confuse artifice for truth. These things, artifice and truth, are, as I take them, in no competition. Fictional truth differs from historical, philosophical, and theological truth, not in kind, but in style. Perhaps it is because, as a literary critic, I'm all too open to the many valences of the category of fiction. History, for example. I think we have to say that history is the writing of a certain kind of fiction, given that fiction, as Wood puts it in Literature and the Taste of Knowledge, names not a body of works, but a relation to reality. What I mean is this. If literature, as Wood supposes, is the circumstantial history of what hasn't happened, history must be the creative retelling of what has happened. It gets the dates and places right, but the people wrong, whereas fiction gets the people right and the dates and places wrong. History is then the creative setting down and writing of a body of knowledge that also is the result of the creative selection and interpretation of diverse sources, some living, many dead, even more of themselves also written history, and on it goes. As when, in Nabokov's example, an observer makes a detailed picture of the whole universe, but when he is finished, he realizes that it is still lacking something, his own self. So he puts himself in it too. But again, the self remains outside and so forth in an endless sequence of projections, like those advertisements which depict a girl holding a picture of herself, holding a picture of herself, holding a picture of herself, holding a picture of herself. He says it about 5 more times, that only coarse printing prevents one's eye from making out. History as a discourse becomes then, if I can put it that way, just as the human mind brushes up against a reality that it must recollect anew, and which it then must restage, we hope, compelling. By compelling, I mean believable or useful. We know the shape of the United States and the relative positions of its major cities, says Bernard Lonergan in Believe Today's Issue, because we've seen, examined, perhaps copied maps. But are the maps accurate? We do not know that. We believe it. Borges wrote even more about maps, and one of the many truths he learned from them is that they create the world they simulate. That is, even more, the simulation that the map is precedes the reality. Every map is accurate according to the intention of its maker. The rub lies in whether the map also is compelling or useful to others. Since our coming to know is a group enterprise, Lonergan continues, coming to know is possible just insofar as it is possible for men and women to believe one another. What I think we tend to forget then, and which we keep forgetting in today's crisis of belief in just about everything, is that in order to be believable, compelling, or useful, history, which news programs are trying to write in real time and at a never-before-seen scale of dissemination, must also contain a certain creative force. Many untrue things are perfectly believable, and people believe them because the style of the story, the way it is told, never mind how the facts are spun, is just too damn good that one could hardly want, let alone be able, to rend the content from the truth. This is the problem of unreliable narratives. They are not, as is popularly believed, bad people whose self-proclaimed goodness we should doubt. They are narrators, and the novelistic tradition is full of them, whose very existence within the fiction is contested. Where then is truth, or where is knowledge, when existence is up for debate? The same can be said, I think, of certain kinds of theological writing. The Dionysian corpus, a body of texts without which St. Thomas would be not quite St. Thomas, offers a clear example of fiction's more insidious aspect, its glorying in a lie, as grounding and guarding the sacred truth of theology. For the mystic behind the mask named Dionysius the Areopagite, he too is a literary fiction, but not a falsehood. It is well known that in this corpus, the mysterious author refers to theological debates which took place centuries after the life and time of the historical Dionysius, whom Paul evangelized. Clues planted or errantly ignored, indicating to clever readers the fact of his charade. But not, I don't think, the truth of it. For it is the literary assumption of the name of a saint, as von Balthasar and more recently Charles Stang have argued, that allows the man behind the mask to die to the world, to become as unknown to himself as the unknown God with whom he seeks union. By writing he dies, by writing he is born a new fictionable body from which he, Dionysius the Areopagite, refuses to be extricated. So the Dionysian corpus, we can say, is also founded upon a fiction. I have no problem simply saying that it just is fiction. We could also call it a lie if we wanted to. That is Socrates' issue with the arts, after all, because lies and other forms of deception take us further away from the real. But who is the real Dionysius the Areopagite, and why can there not be two? And therein lies, I think, the fundamental lesson of the Dionysian corpus. Truth and fiction, or deceits, are not in competition. To ask if fiction can be true, to me, seems similar to asking whether the color red can be true. But if we reverse it, if we start asking whether the truth can be read, whether the truth is not also fictional, people start shifting about their chairs sometimes, but I think we're onto something. Since in life, as in reading, in Dionysius as in the Don Quixote, the truth and the real are what I want to call fictionable. The term comes from Finnegan's Wake, where James Joyce, according to Wood, who I know is a better reader of this novel than I, is thinking of the fashionable world and putting himself at some distance from it. The fashionable world. Now, if there's one thing I know about Michael Wood, it is that he knows how to land a plane without letting the wheels touch ground. For this reason, I'm not sure if by fashionable he means popular or manufactured. Probably both, and I think there's a sharp point in the blurring, as to conceive of the fictionable as also fashionable gets us to the heart of our crisis in belief. Essential to credibility, genuine or ill-gotten, is that its claim to truth or knowledge fall in accordance with willing, eager ears, as those ears desire to recognize it. And because it is so easy to be misunderstood or willfully misinterpreted, whether in writing, which always and inevitably sunders author from text, or in speech, which is fickle as wind, we must be very careful about the way that we perform, about the style with which we imbue the claims to truth and knowledge we have to impart. That they are fashionable on the one hand, and fashionable on the other. Now, Lonergan speaks of the task of coming to know as a division of labor. Among its tasks are accurate observation, truthful speech, and, quote, to select your words precisely. These three things make up what he calls the individual's performance in support of the labor. True creativity involves embellishment, certainly, but embellishment is, I think, simply awareness, or it is simply what happens when one is aware that another actor is watching. Another word could be style. To select our words precisely, and to conceive, as Lonergan does, of the condition of the possibility of a division of labor in the acquisition and development of knowledge. Is this not to say that knowledge also is manufactured, and that the world is fictionable? The map creates the world the cartographer desires. But what if we do not design the map? And who the hell is this implied we? That, I think, is where we're at in our current crisis of belief, especially in this American context. The call for papers refers to the fact that while many people seem to have little doubt about who and what to believe, there have emerged anxieties about to what extent popular credulity has any connection with inherent credibility. What troubles me is that this could have been written, and certainly could be affirmed, as much by a regular viewer of OAN, one American news network, and therefore someone who thinks that Fox News is moderate at best, as by someone who consults whatever the woke liberal version of OAN is. We've seen that 1984 has been weaponized from both sides of the aisle, so it is now rather useless. So I think we need to look elsewhere. Central to Lonergan's project, or so I gather, given that I am more and more in the conflict space, are the various confluences of belief and knowledge in religion and science. But we are now in a place, I think, where the help that science could give is not so much irrelevant as unfashionable, as it is computer science that has given us artificial intelligence more generally, and large language models especially. Now, I'm not here to doom about them. Whether generative AI and LLMs are here to stay, I leave it to the speculation of others. What is certain, though, is that they're here, and they're wreaking havoc on our epistemological ecosystem in ways that literary theorists find to be rather similar to the problems about belief, knowledge, inference, and interpolation that literature more generally, and the novel especially, has raised and explored from time immemorial, or at least since the Quixote. The literary criticism takes many forms. Nan-Zida argues that its foundational role as an adjudicator of inferences from recorded texts is newly relevant because inferences from recorded texts are now being made at scale. Da goes on to discuss one of the principal challenges LLMs present to literature and to the task of literary criticism that I think is directly relevant to our purposes here today. AI operates, she says, at the place where data is being turned into inference, and where it fills in how you get from point A to point B based on paths that look good enough or likely enough. This helps us redefine literature as logical sequences requiring inferential intelligence, both in the composition, the writer's task, and the re-rendering, the reader's task. LLMs and literary criticism meet then in this difficulty of separating what is certain in a text from what is implied, and the forgotten or overlooked inferences and interpolations that may form their confusion. Inevitable in both, Da adds, is that you have to extrapolate and deduce from the given data and make out enough inferences from these facts, yet you will arrive at somewhere that's not quite supported by the text. But how far is too far? Where are the bad neighborhoods, and who decides? LLMs are exacerbating these questions, newly returning them to literary critics with a heightened sense of urgency and perhaps a good amount of panic, because, as Da adds, they naturalize an indistinction between data, inference, and interpolation. This naturalization happens when biases enter AI pipelines in the more obvious form of hard programming choices, but much more so in the less obvious one of shared methods and crude deductions from language. Data is something that is added by processing. It's not data, but it's not far from data. These two things become confused, as what data is, Da continues, could be just a compressed unit of something else's interpreted decisions. Too many predictive algorithms produce too many outputs, and all those outputs cannot simply go to waste. They end up re-entering the pipeline as data and behave as data in mechanically, commercially, legally, and legislatively binding ways. What will happen, she asks, when data and inference or interpolation are classified and treated as the same types of objects, because in practical terms, they can no longer be separated. That is where we are now. So near the center of our current crisis of belief, I think, is a crisis of credibility. The question for many Americans, I think, is how do I know, or upon what basis do I believe, that this or that source is credible? Part of me wants to say it's a little arrogant formulating the question in this way. For how could one possibly know that one is equipped to judge another's credibility if one also believes that all information outlets that do not support one's point of view are already false, that there is nothing in them that offers knowledge? Self-conscious fiction, I think, and I believe it because I speak from my own experience, can be of some methodological help here, because it criticizes two things and two things only: itself and its reader. A little humility goes a long way in this case, and I think self-conscious fiction can be of a certain help in our current crisis, because the crisis is with our very own sense of self and how we fashion and make truth and knowledge believable. Self-conscious literature can be so helpful in dealing with these problems because it presents a creative counterpart to what Lonergan is after when he refers to the enormous process in which meanings are elaborated and values are discerned in a far more reflective, deliberate, critical fashion. As self-conscious fiction holds up a mirror showing to readers the things they have believed, as well as the structures that have made that belief possible. Yes, they also undercut all possibilities of public faith from the beginning, but I'm of the mind that too much willing suspension of disbelief is rather what got us in this mess. The current crisis of belief is so insidious because we have chosen in various ways to hide ourselves from the fictionable mechanisms behind all forms of and claims to knowledge. That behind every news program are cameras, scripts, makeup artists, the whole lot of it, and behind all these things is what actually happened. We have to find ways to identify the artifice behind all constructions of knowledge, as well as how to parse between good and bad constructions. There's a difference, as Daw puts it, between good enough inference and actually good inference. It is a distinction that literary criticism is by nature allergic to, and yet here we are as literary critics having to say, now there is such a thing as good and bad inference, good and bad interpretation. Self-conscious fiction is so important in this regard because by drawing attention to its artificiality, it provides a humane and humanizing space in which to test out the many ways that truth and knowledge are made fictionable. It is precisely this self-critical gaze on what is believed and how what is believed is made credible that I think is needful in this moment, if indeed we are to believe in the possibility that knowledge still is possible, that we're not stuck in a post-truth world, that we can fight the disorientation, disillusionment, crisis, surrender of belief of which Lonergan speaks. So only by acknowledging, exposing, and celebrating, I think, artifice that's underlying all attempts to create and sustain belief and to disseminate knowledge, that behind all of this, how can I put, that behind all of this, all the claims to truth and knowledge is human creativity, and therefore intentionality. That is the only time where we can begin responsibly to confront all the competing claims to truth against heresy, real from fake news, reasonable inference from bad faith or unthought interpolation. And then you have all the artifice that underlies the whole lot of it. My suggestion then is simple. I am convinced of the value for theologians of beginning to learn to think with fiction and to think with literary criticism, as it is the route that was more or less forced upon me during my doctoral work. I, for one, am purposefully trying not to think with theology, but next to it or in confrontation with it. Because I think the real fight, the fight still to be had, is not or is no longer between religion and science, but between religion and literature, because both take belief as their core business. Literature, writes Wood, is fiction in the fullest, most powerful sense when it sets out to encounter real knowledge along imaginary roads. This is not to say that science no longer poses an existential threat to religion, or that people finally no longer believe that science somehow refutes faith. Only that I do not believe that science, of which computer science is a species, can properly diagnose and treat its own maladies. AI and LLMs are not the be-all and end-all of our epistemological problems, of our crisis in belief. But damn it if they do not perfectly encapsulate everything that is at stake. Daw writes, AI is a true forcing move for cultural and intellectual work because it forces us to go back to our foundations and to find precisely what kind of humane intelligence we can offer at our best, and where that intelligence is maximally strained, we're at least subject to quality control and how that ramifies. Unlike news programs, videos shared on social media, even when they are shortened to exclude as much of their meaningful and therefore truthful context as their editor so desires, LLMs are almost impossible to historicize because they lack intentionality. Sure, LLMs contain biases. They perform interpolations and recycle them back out as data, which just throws our preconceived notions about data ontology into total disarray, but there is just no intentionality to it. LLMs have all the same stuff as the best and worst news programming, but it is all so well hidden. They hide their artificiality, and for this reason, I think, even when they are correct, they are not only wrong, but they offer no knowledge, only what the coding indicates is reasonably likely to follow. The word day will almost always end the phrase have good. The word one is an even better choice because it is so amorphous. Because it could mean so much, it therefore means absolutely nothing. A great big fill-in-the-blank generator cannot think, and for this reason, it cannot actually offer knowledge. I like to tell the story when I was a sophomore in high school. I told my father, a financial advisor at Morgan Stanley, to invest in Apple. The iPhone had just come out. I was right. I was very right. But I had no knowledge. No knowledge whatsoever. I was running on vibes, and so are LLMs. To fight then against this crisis of belief and all the competing claims to truth and knowledge that confront us, we need not to willingly suspend disbelief. We believe far too much, and for this reason, knowledge is harder to come by. We should not suspend our disbelief that LLMs do not have intentionality, the one basic prerequisite of meaning-making, and therefore of knowledge. Indeed, Coleridge's notion of poetic faith is a prominent cause of this contemporary confusion concerning competing claims to truth and performances of credibility. Rather, as it is central to Lonergan's conviction that the Church, in considering its own approach to belief and knowledge, also should consider the social order and cultural achievements of the modern and contemporary world, the needful supplement comes not from science, that decrepit competitor of religion, but self-conscious fiction, which the Church as a whole seems entirely to have ignored the entire literary enterprise as a threat or a friend to anything. Self-conscious fiction is so necessary, I think, and can be so helpful because it persistently points out just how unavoidable and how indispensable is artifice for clearing space for the belief and the mechanisms of belief that make knowledge possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. Questions? Yeah, Andrew.
Thanks so much. This is super interesting, especially coming after Father Humphreys. We can confirm, correct, or reject this, but can you hear me okay?
For the most part.
Okay, I'll try to be louder. Just an anecdote and then the question. I once had lunch with a group of, endangered species of rhetoricians. And it was super interesting because being a Plato guy at heart, I was the enemy. Right, the way they told the story was the sophists were the champions. And it's a sort of postmodern Richard Rorty, Jacques Derrida sort of thing. Whereas it turns out telling the story, however you wanted, was the power. And Plato was wrong, insofar as Plato didn't note that he was the one trying to tell the story about truth. Of course, Plato knew it, and it was surreptitious, and et cetera, that's the kind of story of that angle of rhetoric. And we, the other side, the philosophers, killed it. So I see you sort of, if I understand you correctly, trying to bridge these two worlds in some sense. But I wonder if, and this is my question, if the postmodern tendency to want to do that has, as Father Humphrey pointed out, I think correctly, to some understanding, has already disassembled that bridge to such an extent that rebuilding it, no one's going to cross it. In other words, to say fictionable even, people are going to say, oh, I get to make up what I want. And so I wonder on what foundation, for Lonergan, it's cognitional critique, philosophy of self-affirmation, self-appropriation. I wonder if you think that's right, or if you think that's just another story. In other words, Lonergan begins method and theology by saying there's a rock upon which we can stand. There's a sort of foundationalism in that the other side does not want. And I just wonder how you bridge that. I'm super curious because it was so thought-provoking, so thank you. And beautifully written, if I can say so.
Thank you, no, I appreciate that. It's a good question. I wrestle with it myself because I guess for my own very short story time, my background is theology. It was in writing a dissertation on the problem of identity and repetition in Nabokov that turned me into, I guess I'm doing literature now, or I guess I've always been trying to do literature. And with it, having two completely different conceptions and almost two completely different languages for asking very similar questions. And I'm really fascinated in, can those languages translate? Or are both sides fated to thinking that one of them gets to maintain their original language while the other one has to get translated? I think Michael Boyd comes the closest to establishing, he'll be the first to admit that whether or not the postmoderns or people that are in the literary side of things, whether or not they don't want to have foundations, they're gonna eventually have to admit that they do have them and they insist on them rather adamantly. Michael gives an example. We're talking about whether or not, that even like in fiction, you can, in theory, just make up whatever you want in fiction. When two characters get married, you know exactly what it means. Two completely non-existent things can get married, and we know what that means. That's a really, there is a strong tie to a foundational concept of reality that is inherent to fiction that no amount of invention will get rid of. The difficulty, I think, is literary critics, I think it's just, we're tied so strongly to this idea of invention and newness, and fiction kind of overriding everything, that fiction is just what we do. It's the creative apprehension and understanding memory of the reality that we encounter. But I think a lot of it is both disciplines thinking past each other and talking past each other. But again, my work is trying to see if there's a way to bridge that gap. My next big project right now is looking at Jan Foss's work, septology. He just won the Nobel Prize in Literature last year, or 2 years ago. And other works, Nabokov, Flaubert, asking the question of, can literary works believe more or otherwise than their authors believed or intended to believe? And for me, that's one way of asking that question of how do we build that bridge that we do actually need, but will anyone bother wanting to cross it? I believe the answer is people will want to cross it, but inherent in that desire to cross it is this assumption or this hope that we were wrong about the person or the faculty down the hall.
It might just...
So yeah, I don't know. The real answer is I'm not certain.
No, thank you. Just a quick follow-up, because it made me think with Lonergan, someone like Father Joe Flanagan has some reflections on this, but Lonergan's topics in education, when he talks about, what's the phrase, when he talks about the artist and the quasi-operator of the aesthetic, right? Mm-hmm. That's a place to go that I think Lonergan, he talks about creation in a way that's, it seems dissonant from others, but the way I'd say it, it's less cerebral. Right. In other words, you talk about openness to mystery at a sort of level of experience that you see in, like Father Doran's stuff on elemental meaning and things like this, that might be helpful for that bridge. I think you just have so much resources. It'd be super interesting to hear how you follow that up, because I don't know, but thank you.
No, I definitely will, thank you. I mean, and to counter or add to that, I do think having forced myself last year to familiarize myself with as much Lonergan as I could. Michael Wood's book, Literature and the Taste of Knowledge, he and Lonergan feel stylistically very similar to me, even though they write very different kinds of prose, just because they're very adamant. Let's slow everything down to where it feels like we're not even moving, just to clarify what the hell is going on right now, even if clarifying what might not be going on takes about 300 pages. But at least we finally have settled on the question after 300 pages of figuring out and trying to wrestle what's going on. And Michael Wood is really good at doing that with whether or not literary texts know things or know things other than their authors. So, yeah, but I'll definitely look up if Jonathan can text me.
Yeah, I'll send you some, I'll point you some directions. Humphrey, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, but maybe if I don't understand you, you may correct me. I understand that fiction, in certain cases, there are some fictional writings, creative writings, that will be so obvious that they are rooted on real history, like something like The Animal Farm of George Orwell. However, listening to you, it seems that you tend to, I was listening to you with a little bias from Plato on the allegory of the divided line, of which it seems you try to place history and fiction at what I think they may not share in Plato, because for Plato, probably history will be at the level of reality, but then fictions will be at the level of the lower level of images, fabrications, not always fabrication, but at least product of creativity. So my question, if, like I said, if I understood you wrongly, you may correct me, if from what you said, or what I understood from what you said, history and creative writing or fiction belong to the same, call it level, or the same valency of cultural value, as Lonergan would call it, where do we draw the line?
It's a good question. I mean, the distinction I'd want to draw first is, I think there's a little bit of there's a prescriptive definition of what history should be as opposed to fiction. And then, at least, again, I said it towards the end of my talk, that what I'm trying to do is think with the fiction and think with the literary critics, and especially think with the authors of the fiction. And one thing that authors of fiction are really good at, one thing that literature can do, I believe, that no other discourse can do, is that it can steal from any other discourse, completely flatten it, and now it's fiction. Or now it's literature. For instance, if you were to, let's say James Joyce and Ulysses were to randomly insert 300 pages of case law into it, just verbatim, are we reading case law or are we reading fiction? More than anything else, we're reading fiction. That's, I think, really difficult, and fiction throws the entire concept of other discourses as completely and utterly unique into disarray. And part of that is what I'm getting after, because I think fiction is disruptive. It's horribly disruptive. You go bowling, and you think you're getting rid of the bumpers, and you find out you're in a baseball field. And so with that, I think we have this prescriptive understanding of history, that it is supposed to do this as opposed to fiction. Whereas if we have this much more generous notion of fiction, which is going to be this notion of fiction that we find in the authors of fiction as thinkers and in a lot of literary theorists because they're dealing with fiction, now we have this descriptive understanding that really does change of what is ultimately going to separate history from fiction, unless we understand fiction in this generative and much more generous sense of fiction is just the human creative element. It names a relation to reality, but that relation is constant. And that's really, I think, what the fiction writers are getting at, that everything is fictional. That risks, of course, saying that nothing is fictional. If everything is fictional, then nothing is. But I think what it highlights is we're always wrestling with the threat of inference and interpolation. We're always risking confusing those things with the hard data. And whenever there's communication, whenever there's sharing knowledge, whenever there's any amount of communication going on, it's never just bare data. It's all these other aspects of creative performance that I think Lonergan is slightly gesturing to them. But yeah, the intent is more or less to use fiction as an ally of disrupting every other discourse. because that's what fiction just does in its own right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Erik. Fascinating presentation and well delivered. I wanted to ask about the line that you quoted regarding the willing suspension of disbelief as that connects to cynicism. Specifically, there's this term that I ran across recently in a paper on psychology, and I can't remember the author's names, and I apologize, but the term that they use is the cynical genius illusion, which is something that you find occurring in all kinds of different contexts wherein people think that the more cynical they are, the smarter they are. And the researchers discovered by using questionnaires that, at least by using tests of intelligence, which may or may not be accurate, they found there was no correlation. If you're extremely cynical, that does not mean you are above the mean in terms of intelligence. But it made me think about something that I noticed in dialoguing with some of my relatives who very fervently believe what I consider to be fictions, such as, for example, that sunscreen causes cancer. I have some relatives that are very convinced, and I might at first, and this is a temptation that I have, to dismiss them as being gullible people or people that are low IQ or dim-witted in some way. But if I talk to them, I realize that they are just very cynical, and they think I'm the one who is deluded because I too readily believe all these scientists who tell me that there is no correlation between sunscreen and cancer. So in a sense, what they are is just very critical thinking people who believe that it is only the minority who tells the truth, and in this case, the minority is that group of people who are telling you not to wear sunscreen because of cancer. So I'm wondering then, is it the case that our problem is the willing suspension of disbelief, or is it that we have a tendency to want to disbelieve everything and then believe the weirdest things possible?
Yeah, I love that. There's I saw recently, I forgot where, Jonathan might remember it. It happened on The Wonderful World of Blue Sky, where someone was saying about how everyone disagrees with me about this, and says it must be really difficult. It's like what is going on? All these people with PhDs disagree with me. They must be wrong. But I think with what's going on there, with the willing suspension of disbelief, what I'm not trying to get after is definitely like, let's just indulge in radical, rampant skepticism. Because at the end of the day, even if we do that, then let's say if we say that there are no facts, but that there is no data that isn't always already interpreted, we don't get rid of the facts, we just defer them one more level, and one more level, and one more level. The facts don't go away, we just postpone them and refuse to deal with them. So with the self-conscious fiction, there's that element of it where you're still supposed to believe, like there is a story going on here, there's human interest, all of those things, but you're aware that it's fiction. You're aware that there's a construct going on. And of course, I know there's the tendency of, especially like, let's say you do medical journals, of, follow the money. Is Elsevier or whatever they are, who is funding all of this medical studies? I think the way to fight that is that's where you do need that foundation of, no, like, maybe the hands are dirty, but, there's still some soap in the system. They're still getting it clean. The knowledge is coming through, even if, I don't know, the delivery isn't always perfect, but that's where, to the first question I was given, I think we still need to have that sense that there is a real foundation, that there is a rock we stand on. And I think the radical skepticism is refusing to acknowledge that rock. It's the problem with unreliable narrators of, for instance, if you read Lolita, Humbert is a famous unreliable narrator, not just because he is an absolutely horrible person, but because if you follow the literary gamesmanship all the way down, it's possible that Humbert doesn't exist within the fiction, and what you're reading is just a novel that Humbert wrote. And so now you have this problem. If you follow the unreliability all the way down, you have to draw the line somewhere. Otherwise, you have to doubt absolutely everything. And so there is some sense where we have to believe in fictional works, in the human interest story that's going on. Otherwise, we'll end up with Bikar, is everyone else just a fiction of my imagination? And so we do need that foundation. I don't know how on literary grounds that you could ever possibly prove it. But that, I think, is exactly the problem that we're getting at. It's just if we completely suspend disbelief, I think we start believing too many things. And we end up in this mess of everyone has an equal point of view, and there's just competing truths, no one big one. If that makes sense.
So first of all, thank you for explaining my first year of theology to me.
My experience with that would make more sense to me.
Anyway, so, I mean, lots there. I mean, the whole question of maps, I mean, I've been working on sort of questions about colonization and indigenous peoples, and maps are serious ways in which falsehoods were advanced, right? But it occurred to me as you're talking, like, the idea of fictionability, I just wonder if that presses a question that Lonergan also pressed, which is that at the end of the day, we're not going to determine what's true, what we can affirm, what we can judge as true, through some procedure, or through some disciplinary perspective, or whether we call something history or fiction. But the fictionability of everything ends up meaning that we can't get away from character. That we can't get away from the personal responsibility to making the best judgment that one can, right? That at the end of the day, then the affirmation of what is true is dependent on the person. Is that the effect of that? It seems to me that would be the effect of that, is to say that once you put everything on one continuum, which I think makes sense. I come from the world of literary criticism, so it makes sense. Like, it's not pure voluntarism. It doesn't have to be pure voluntarism. It can be. But instead, it's a say, you know, there is no way around a knower. Right? There is no way around the person making judgments. Does that work? Is that one effect of what you're getting at?
Yes, entirely. Is that if we put it all on one spectrum, which I really like the way you put it that way, is that now the criticism turns back on ourselves of how am I telling this? What are my motives, or what are all of our motives in this communal process of coming to knowledge? Right. So it turns it back on the necessary of historicizing, on intentionality, and so it does return us to who and what are the actors, and what are they acting upon, and for what reasons are they acting in their fictionalizing the world, in their creative responses to the bare data, in making maps, in telling stories.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for this. I love your description of reality as disputed territory, because I think the chapter and topics that Andrew pointed you to on aesthetic judgment recovers this sense for Lonergan that our judgments exhaust potentially the intelligibility of a question, but not the intelligibility of reality. Right? So we can go back to the same data and ask lots of different questions. One's about fiction, and one's about science, and one's about everything in between. So I think my question follows on this last one. I'm just wondering, well, let me put it simply, and then I'll fumble through a bigger version of it. I think what you mean by creativity, Lonergan just means by intelligence. And I guess I'm wondering about the value. So it seems to me like keeping a kind of aesthetic creativity in a sort of differentiated realm, which is how Lonergan tends to think about it, in a way protects its distinctness, in a way that can still allow you to sort of recover a sort of deeply robust sense in which this is intelligent and it's a vehicle for truth, and it does things other forms of knowledge and communication do not do. And I wonder if that's, and I don't have a settled thought on this, I'm just curious what you think, if the sort of like universalization of fictional ability as a way of acknowledging the sort of human component in any sort of construction of reality, fictional, what we traditionally call fictional or not, sort of like dilutes the power of, or the sort of distinctness of what literature does. And sort of in universalizing it, sort of threatens it in some way. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a paired, Eric, can I ask a paired question with that, which is the inverse of it?
Sure.
Which is, are the literary theorists concerned about fiction being pure?
Yeah.
Purely fictional? in part because I can imagine a way of dealing with what you're talking about where fictionization is ordered to other ends and so therefore governed by the rationality of those ends, measured against the criteria of those ends, right? And so you're still fictionalizing, but it's not pure anymore. And so on the other end, are the literary theorists interested in sort of fictionality in a pure modality, or have they abandoned any kind of notion that you could have a pure fiction?
Yeah, you've said pure so often, I keep thinking of Jesse Pinkman's line saying it may be blue, but it's the bomb.
Great character in Modern.
Absolutely wonderful. So, okay, here's the issue, and probably why I enjoy Michael Wood so much. Literary critics are indeed very worried about wanting to maintain some amount of purity. Michael Wood is, what I find so endearing and frustrating and magical about Michael Wood is he's really good, I think, at thinking with the authors of fiction against the literary critics. Where the writers of fiction, so Flaubert, Borges, Nabokov, those three especially, but Cervantes, we see it in the Quixote, Toni Morrison's doing similar things too, they're all happily going to say everything is some degree of fiction. The literary critics, I don't think, want to say that because then that would mean that the entire discipline is up for renegotiation at best and defunding at worst. I think there's a similar thing in Russell McCutcheon's book, Manufacturing Religion, when he talks about this idea of sui generis religion insulates religious studies from those very same problems. But if we think of religion as sui generis, how do we actually connect it to other things? But that's at least his problem. So I think with that, I think the reason the authors, actually I don't know why the authors want to, but the authors are very adamant to use creativity or imagination, not in the sense that Lonergan would use imagination, not in this Kantian sense, but in the very popular sense we use it today. Authors are going to want to use, have wanted and continue to use imagination and creativity in terms that are intentionally wide and broad, that I think Lonergan and other theologians, and just pretty much anyone that's not a fiction writer, is going to bristle at. And I think their point is because they want to level it and put it all on a spectrum. I just don't think it's necessarily been entirely tried either by the literary critics. And it's been tried in fits and starts. Roland Barthes got close to doing it at times. Derrida kind of did, but do we ever know what Derrida intended? Not really. So, again, I feel like I'm giving non-answer after non-answer here because I think the authors, who are the ones I find so fascinating, what the texts themselves are doing, is they are inviting us to consider what if the entire thing, all of it's all just fictional, and this is very much at the heart of that age-old analogy between God and the author. And Nabokov in interviews very famously said, I think all writing is deception, but I think I'm in good company. I love turning water into wine as a child. It's great. It's, tasteless, but it's great. And so with that, I think what happens is God, for the author, they're very traditional and orthodox in the sense, not only creates creation, but creates the conditions of creation. Does the entire thing, the mechanisms of belief and the belief itself. Authors like to believe that they are doing the exact same thing, and they're going to want to point out that in our construction and interaction with the real, or the different types of the real, we're all more or less doing the same thing. And by putting on the spectrum, we can see that there are dangerous versions of it and generative versions of it. But I think if we were to keep fiction as pure or sui generis, that there's a pure fiction as opposed to broadly kind of fictional acts that we only use the word fictional because we don't have a better word. I think at that point now that veers into the tendency, I think, of saying, MAGA Christians aren't real Christians or something along those lines. Whereas the prescriptive is great, but the descriptive also needs to be there in order for an actual moral critique to be made.
Great. Thank you, Erik. Thanks so much.